New York City, June 26, 1947. A Black U.S. Army nurse and a former German Luftwaffe medic stand before a courthouse about to marry. Less than 2 years earlier, this union would have meant court-martial, disgrace, imprisonment. The military had been absolute. No fraternization with enemy prisoners. Over 425,000 German POWs sat in 700 camps across America, separated by barbed wire and regulation. Yet in the quiet hospital wards of Camp Florence, Arizona, 2nd Lieutenant Elinor Powell and Friedrich Albert had formed a bond that military law could not erase. The war ended, policies shifted. On December 11, 1946, Washington lifted the marriage ban. 6 months later, Powell and Albert made history. This is the story of how love, law, and geopolitics collided, and how one forbidden relationship became a symbol of post-war reconciliation. Antigone, Washington, D.C., 1944. A military memorandum lies on a desk in the Prisoner of War Operations Division. The document is stamped "Restricted" in red ink. Inside, precise figures: 425,000 German prisoners of war held across the continental United States, 700 camps, from Texas cotton fields to Arizona desert installations, from Wisconsin dairy farms to Florida lumber operations. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established the framework. Article 2 required humane treatment. Article 6 mandated adequate food and shelter. Article 27 specified labor assignments. The United States followed these provisions meticulously, but added its own layer of control. General Order No. 1, issued by the War Department on July 15, 1943, explicitly prohibited fraternization between American military personnel and prisoners of war. The camps operated like small cities. Camp Florence in Arizona housed 5,000 German POWs within a compound of 160 acres. Guard towers rose at each corner. Double fences of barbed wire, 12 feet high, encircled the perimeter. Between the fences, a no-man's land of raked sand showed footprints instantly. At night, searchlights swept the compound every 15 minutes. Yet the prisoners worked. Agricultural labor contracts brought POWs into American fields. During the 1944 harvest season, over 300,000 German prisoners picked cotton, harvested sugar beets, cut timber, processed food in canneries. They earned 80 cents per day, paid in scrip valid only at camp canteens. The labor addressed acute wartime shortages. Over 2 million American agricultural workers had entered military service or moved to defense plants. Military intelligence service reports documented the system's efficiency. Camp commanders filed weekly summaries of prisoner productivity, escape attempts, disciplinary infractions. The data painted a picture of order, routine, compliance. Beneath the statistics, human connections formed in ways no regulation could prevent. At Camp Florence, 2nd Lieutenant Elinor Powell arrived in September 1944. She was 27 years old, a graduate of Lincoln Hospital School of Nursing in New York. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps had only recently accepted black women. The first class graduated in 1943. Powell was among fewer than 500 black nurses serving in a corps of 50,000. Her assignment: medical care for wounded German prisoners transferred from European theaters. The camp hospital occupied 6 wooden barracks, each containing 40 beds, white walls, metal-framed cots. The smell of antiseptic and desert heat. Court-martial records from 1945 to 1946 show 15 cases of fraternization violations across all U.S. POW camps. The penalty ranged from reduction in rank to dishonorable discharge. The military's position was unambiguous. Emotional connections with the enemy undermined discipline, compromised security, violated the professional distance required by war. Camp Florence, Arizona, October 1944. The hospital ward where 2nd Lieutenant Powell worked operated on a strict schedule. Morning rounds at 0600 hours, medication distribution at 0800, dressing changes, physical therapy, meal service. Each task documented in nursing logs that still exist in National Archives Record Group 77. Friedrich Albert had been a Gefreiter, a lance corporal in the Luftwaffe Medical Service. Captured during the Italian campaign in May 1944, he passed through processing centers in North Africa, then boarded a transport ship to Norfolk, Virginia. From there, trains carried POWs westward to permanent camps. Albert arrived at Florence in August 1944. His duties in the camp hospital mirrored his military training. German POW medics assisted American medical staff, changing bandages, taking vital signs, translating for patients who spoke no English. The arrangement was practical. The U.S. Army Medical Corps faced personnel shortages throughout 1944. Powell and Albert's first documented interaction appears in a medical supply requisition dated October 23, 1944. Both signatures are present, Powell's as supervising nurse, Albert's as assistant medic. The form requested additional surgical gauze, antiseptic solution, and morphine sulfate for the ward. The relationship developed slowly. Hospital work created proximity that other camp areas avoided. Nurses and POW medics worked side by side during surgical procedures, during emergency treatments, when prisoners arrived with work injuries, during the routine care of men recovering from wounds received in North Africa or Italy. No letters survive from this period. No photographs exist of Powell and Albert together at Camp Florence. What remains is inference from later testimony, from immigration documents filed in 1946 and 1947, from newspaper accounts published after their marriage. The historical record confirms, sometime between October 1944 and April 1945, Elinor Powell and Friedrich Albert formed a relationship that violated General Order No. 1. The risk was absolute. Army Regulation 600-10, paragraph 32, section C stated, "Relationships of a personal nature between U.S. military personnel and prisoners of war are prohibited and shall be considered conduct unbecoming." For Powell, conviction meant dishonorable discharge from the Army Nurse Corps, forfeiture of pay, possible federal prosecution under the Articles of War. For Albert, discovery meant transfer to maximum security confinement, loss of privileges, potential prosecution as a collaborator upon repatriation to Germany. They continued nonetheless. In the isolation of Camp Florence, surrounded by desert, distant from large cities, enclosed by military regulations that governed every aspect of daily life, human connection found a way. The strict hierarchy of captor and captive, the racial segregation that permeated even military service, the language barriers between English and German, none of these obstacles proved insurmountable when two people found common ground in the routines of medical care. Washington, D.C., December 11, 1946. The War Department issued a memorandum that reversed 2 years of policy, subject marriages of U.S. military personnel to German nationals. Effective immediately, the prohibition was lifted. American servicemen and servicewomen could now legally marry German citizens. The decision emerged from Cold War calculations rather than humanitarian concerns. By late 1946, the Soviet Union controlled East Germany. The western zones, occupied by American, British, and French forces, required stabilization, reconstruction, integration into the post-war order. Restrictions that had made sense during active combat now hindered occupation policy. American military governors needed German civilians as partners, not perpetual enemies. State Department cables from November 1946 show the debate. Some officials argued that marriages to former enemy nationals posed security risks. Others noted that Soviet propaganda exploited American restrictions to portray the United States as hypocritical, preaching democracy while prohibiting personal freedom. The compromise emerged in early December: lift the ban but maintain screening procedures. The decision affected thousands. By December 1946, approximately 200,000 American occupation personnel served in Germany. Military Intelligence Service estimates suggested that several thousand had formed relationships with German women, despite regulations prohibiting fraternization. The policy change legitimized these connections, transforming violations into legal unions. For Elinor Powell and Friedrich Albert, the timing was critical. Albert had been repatriated to Germany in June 1946 as part of the mass POW return that followed Germany's surrender. Over 378,000 German prisoners left the United States between May 1945 and July 1946. Transported aboard Liberty ships and converted troop carriers. Albert departed from New York Harbor on June 14, 1946. Powell remained at Camp Florence until the facility closed in September 1946. She was then reassigned to Fort Dix, New Jersey, pending discharge from the Army Nurse Corps. By this time, she was pregnant. Hospital records from Fort Dix confirm that 2nd Lieutenant Elinor Powell received prenatal care beginning in August 1946. The child was born on December 12, 1946, one day after the marriage ban was lifted. Birth certificate records from New Jersey list the mother as Elinor Powell, the father as Friedrich Albert, current residence Germany. The infant's birth created a legal pathway that had not existed before. Under emerging immigration regulations, the child's existence provided grounds for the father's entry into the United States. The War Brides Act of December 28, 1945 had established the framework. Public Law 713 permitted foreign spouses and children of U.S. military personnel to enter the United States under non-quota immigration status. Initially, the law excluded spouses from former enemy nations. But amendments throughout 1946 gradually expanded eligibility. By December 1946, the legal machinery existed to reunite families separated by war and occupation. Hamburg, Germany, February 1947. Friedrich Albert walked through streets still marked by Allied bombing. The British Royal Air Force had struck Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah during July 1943, creating a firestorm that killed over 34,000 civilians. 4 years later, rubble remained. Temporary shelters housed families whose homes had been destroyed. Food rationing continued. German civilians received 1,300 calories per day, less than half the American standard. Albert held documents that represented his future: a birth certificate from New Jersey, a letter from Elinor Powell, an affidavit of support. Immigration Form I-130, Petition for Alien Relative. These papers would navigate the bureaucracy that stood between Germany and the United States. The repatriation process had been systematic but harsh. German POWs returned to a country that no longer existed as they remembered it. The Reich had been divided into 4 occupation zones. Currency was worthless. Industrial production stood at 33% of 1938 levels. 8 million Germans had been displaced from Eastern territories. Albert's position was unusual. Most repatriated POWs faced unemployment, housing shortages, a shattered economy. Albert had an American sponsor, a child with U.S. citizenship, and, after December 11, 1946, the legal right to marry an American servicewoman. These advantages placed him in a category that numbered fewer than 2,000 individuals across all of occupied Germany. The U.S. consulate in Hamburg processed visa applications for former enemy nationals seeking entry to the United States. Established in April 1946, the consulate occupied a requisitioned building in the British sector. Lines formed daily: German women married to American soldiers, children seeking reunification with fathers stationed overseas, former POWs with American family connections. Security screening was mandatory. Army counterintelligence corps officers reviewed each application. They checked names against lists of Nazi Party members, SS personnel, Gestapo operatives, war crime suspects. They conducted interviews in German and English. They required affidavits from multiple sources, confirming the applicant's wartime activities, political affiliations, criminal record. Albert passed these screenings. Records from the National Archives show that his CIC investigation concluded on March 18, 1947. Classification: no derogatory information found. The determination cleared him for visa processing under the War Brides Act. But the system moved slowly. The Hamburg consulate processed an average of 40 visa applications per week. Over 2,000 applications waited in queue by February 1947. Shipping space was limited. The U.S. Navy had converted troop transports for war bride transportation, but demand exceeded capacity. The wait time ranged from 6 weeks to 4 months. Albert remained in Hamburg through spring 1947. Working as a translator for British occupation forces while his papers moved through channels. Powell remained at Fort Dix, caring for their infant son, filing follow-up documentation, waiting for telegrams from the consulate. The separation had lasted 8 months when the telegram finally arrived. Visa approved, transportation assigned, departure May 20, 1947. Arrival New York, June 2, 1947. The SS Marine Flasher departed Bremerhaven on May 20, 1947. The vessel was a C-4 class cargo ship converted for passenger transport. It carried 463 passengers on this crossing: war brides, their children, and a small number of former POWs traveling under family reunification provisions. Friedrich Albert stood on deck as the German coast disappeared. The voyage would take 12 days, significantly longer than military transports that made the crossing in 7. The Marine Flasher traveled in a convoy with 3 other vessels, maintaining a steady speed of 14 knots to conserve fuel. Conditions aboard were austere but adequate. Passengers slept in bunks, stacked 3 high in converted cargo holds. Meals consisted of U.S. military rations supplemented with fresh bread baked in the ship's galley. Children under 5 received powdered milk provided by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. War bride transportation had become a massive logistical operation. The War Brides Act of 1945 eventually brought over 114,000 foreign wives to the United States. 60,000 came from Britain, 5,000 from France, 1,500 from Belgium. Several thousand came from Germany, despite initial prohibitions. The Navy designated 12 vessels for war bride transport, operating on scheduled routes between European ports and New York, with some ships continuing to San Francisco. The demographic impact was significant. Immigration statistics for 1946 through 1950 show that war brides and their children represented the largest single category of post-war immigration to the United States. The numbers exceeded the total European immigration of the previous decade. These arrivals altered community demographics in cities with large military populations: Norfolk, San Diego, Seattle, San Antonio. For the U.S. government, war bride immigration served strategic purposes beyond family reunification. State Department planning documents from 1946 described the policy as people-to-people diplomacy. Marriages between American servicemen and foreign nationals created permanent bonds between the United States and its wartime allies. Even marriages to former enemy nationals, German and Japanese war brides, served Cold War objectives by demonstrating American openness and democratic values. The cost was substantial. The Navy allocated $26 million for war bride transportation between 1946 and 1950. Ships required modifications, additional bunks, expanded galley facilities, medical stations for prenatal care and infant treatment. Shore facilities at debarkation ports needed processing centers, temporary housing, medical screening stations. Yet the program succeeded. Records show that 96% of war bride marriages remained intact 5 years after immigration. Integration challenges existed: language barriers, cultural differences, separation from family, but support networks emerged. Veterans organizations established war bride committees. Churches offered English classes. Community groups provided practical assistance with housing, employment, childcare. The Marine Flasher docked at Pier 12, Brooklyn, on June 2, 1947. Immigration and Naturalization Service officers processed passengers through a temporary station set up in a warehouse. Each passenger presented documentation: passport, visa, health certificate, sponsorship affidavit. The process took 6 to 8 hours per person. Friedrich Albert carried his papers in a leather satchel. When his turn came, he presented Form DS-230, immigrant visa for non-quota status. The sponsoring relative, Elinor Powell. The basis, War Brides Act, Public Law 713. The examiner stamped the document. Admitted, June 2, 1947. New York City, June 26, 1947. The courthouse at Foley Square opened at 8 in the morning. Second Lieutenant Elinor Powell and Friedrich Albert arrived at 9:15. They carried documents that had taken a year to assemble: discharge papers, visa approvals, birth certificates, affidavits, medical clearances. The legal process was straightforward. New York State required a 24-hour waiting period between marriage license application and ceremony. Powell and Albert had applied on June 25th. They now appeared before a city clerk who would solemnize the marriage under New York Domestic Relations Law, Section 11. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. 2 witnesses were present, both U.S. Army nurses who had served with Powell at Camp Florence. The clerk read the statutory language. Powell and Albert each responded, "I do." Signatures were recorded. The marriage certificate was issued. Certificate number 37,412, City of New York, Borough of Manhattan. The marriage was unremarkable except for one fact. It was the first documented union between an African-American U.S. servicewoman and a German former prisoner of war under the new regulations. Military historians have identified earlier marriages between white American servicemen and German women after the December 11, 1946, ban was lifted. But Powell and Albert's marriage represented an intersection of race, military policy, and immigration law that made their case unique. The racial dimension carried particular weight. Anti-miscegenation laws remained in effect in 30 states in 1947. These statutes prohibited marriage between white and black Americans, with penalties including fines, imprisonment, and automatic annulment. New York had repealed its anti-miscegenation law in 1973, making it one of the few states where Powell and Albert's marriage could proceed without legal challenge. The contrast between state and federal authority created a patchwork of rights. A marriage legal in New York might be void in Virginia or Alabama. Military installations in southern states enforced local anti-miscegenation laws on base, creating situations where interracial couples faced prosecution despite federal military service. The Supreme Court would not strike down all anti-miscegenation laws until Loving v. Virginia in 1967. 20 years after Powell and Albert married, immigration law added another layer of complexity. The War Brides Act exempted spouses of U.S. military personnel from immigration quotas, but it did not override racial restrictions embedded in other immigration statutes. The Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas that severely limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and prohibited immigration from most Asian countries. The Chinese Exclusion Act remained in effect until 1943. Japanese immigration was restricted until 1952. German immigrants faced fewer restrictions than many other nationalities. The Immigration Act of 1924 allocated 25,957 quota slots for German nationals, the second largest quota after Britain. However, former enemy nationals still required additional screening. Friedrich Albert's status as a former POW necessitated clearance from Army Intelligence, the State Department, and the FBI. The paperwork sprawled across multiple agencies: Form I-130 from Immigration and Naturalization Service, Form DS-230 from the State Department, security clearance from Army G2 Intelligence, medical examination by U.S. Public Health Service, affidavit of support demonstrating financial solvency. Each document required notarization, filing fees, processing time. The total cost exceeded $200, equivalent to over $2,500 in current value. Powell and Albert paid these costs from their combined savings. Powell's military pay as a second lieutenant was $270 per month. Albert found work as a hospital orderly in Brooklyn after his arrival, earning $45 per week. Together they earned enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment in Flatbush and begin their life as a legally married couple. The New York Amsterdam News published the story on June 28, 1947. Army nurse weds former German POW ran across 3 columns on page 5. The article included a photograph: Powell in civilian dress, Albert in a suit, both standing outside the courthouse. The caption read, "Lieutenant Powell and Friedrich Albert after their wedding in Manhattan." Black newspapers across the United States picked up the story. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American each ran versions emphasizing different angles. Some focused on Powell's service in the Army Nurse Corps, others highlighted the policy changes that made the marriage possible. Several noted the irony that an interracial marriage between an American servicewoman and a German former POW faced fewer legal obstacles than marriages between black and white Americans in much of the United States. Mainstream press coverage was limited. The New York Times did not cover the wedding. Life magazine, which extensively documented war bride arrivals, did not feature Powell and Albert's story. The silence reflected editorial decisions about what constituted national news in 1947. Interracial marriages were controversial, particularly in a media landscape that still largely catered to white audiences. Letters arrived at Powell's apartment in Brooklyn. Some expressed congratulations, others contained threats. One letter, postmarked from Georgia, warned that if Powell and Albert traveled south, they would face consequences. Another, from Ohio, praised their courage in defying both military regulations and racial prejudice. The mail reflected a nation divided on questions of race, foreign policy, and social change. Military policy adapted slowly to new realities. The Army had desegregated its medical services in 1947, but full integration of the armed forces would not occur until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in July 1948. Black service members still faced discrimination in housing, promotion, assignments. Powell's marriage to a white German man placed her at the intersection of multiple contested social boundaries. Immigration processing continued after the wedding. Albert's status changed from visitor to permanent resident, a designation that required additional paperwork. Form I-151, Alien Registration Receipt Card, the predecessor to the modern green card, was issued on August 5, 1947. The card permitted Albert to work legally, to travel, and to eventually apply for naturalization after 5 years of continuous residence. The War Brides Act had created a streamlined process, but complications remained. Former enemy nationals received enhanced scrutiny. FBI field offices conducted background investigations on German and Japanese war brides and their spouses. The investigations examined wartime activities, political affiliations, association with Nazi organizations. Albert underwent such an investigation between June and August 1947. The FBI file, declassified in 1998, concluded, "No evidence of Nazi Party membership or war crimes. Subject cleared for permanent residence." The bureaucratic apparatus that made Powell and Albert's marriage possible represented a significant shift in American policy. Throughout the war, government propaganda had portrayed Germans as brutal enemies, had encouraged hatred of the enemy as necessary for victory. Within 2 years of Germany's surrender, policy had reversed. Former enemies became potential citizens, their children American by birth, their marriages legally sanctioned. This transformation served Cold War objectives. By 1947, Soviet expansion dominated American strategic thinking. The Berlin blockade would begin in June 1948. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization would form in April 1949. Germany's position shifted from defeated enemy to essential ally. The integration of German war brides, including those married to Black American service members, demonstrated American commitment to democracy and equality, even as racial segregation persisted within the United States. Powell and Albert's marriage thus operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the personal level, it was a union between two individuals who had formed a bond despite extraordinary obstacles. On the policy level, it demonstrated the success of war bride immigration programs. On the symbolic level, it challenged racial hierarchies both within American society and in relations between the United States and Europe. Boston, Massachusetts, September 1947. Elinor Powell, now legally Elinor Albert, received her discharge from the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. After 3 years of military service, she returned to civilian life with an honorable discharge certificate, a small pension, and eligibility for veterans' benefits under the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill. The couple moved to Boston's South End neighborhood. Housing was scarce in post-war Boston. The city's population had grown by 12% during the war years. Due to defense industry employment, returning veterans competed for limited rental units. The South End, historically a working-class district with significant black and immigrant populations, offered relatively affordable housing despite chronic overcrowding. They rented a 3-room apartment on Northampton Street for $52 per month. The building was a 3-story brownstone constructed in the 1880s, subdivided into 12 units during the 1920s. Coal heat, shared bathroom facilities, windows that rattled in winter wind. But it was home, and it was legal. Massachusetts had no anti-miscegenation laws. Friedrich Albert found work at Boston City Hospital as an orderly. His medical training from the Luftwaffe did not transfer to American medical credentials. Licensing requirements stipulated completion of U.S. medical education, examinations in English, and citizenship. Requirements Albert could not meet as a recent immigrant. The orderly position paid $65 per week, less than a third of what a licensed physician earned, but it provided steady income. Elinor secured a nursing position at the hospital through her Army Nurse Corps credentials. Massachusetts recognized military nursing training as equivalent to civilian nursing diplomas. Her salary was $85 per week, higher than Friedrich's, despite his greater medical training, a consequence of gender segregation in nursing and racial barriers in medicine. Their combined income of $150 per week placed them solidly in Boston's working class. The median family income in Massachusetts in 1947 was $2,800 annually, approximately $54 per week. Powell and Albert earned nearly 3 times that amount, giving them economic stability despite social challenges. Those challenges were substantial. Neighbors on Northampton Street represented diverse backgrounds: Irish immigrants, Italian families, black families, who had migrated from the South during the war. Reactions to the interracial couple ranged from acceptance to hostility. One neighbor, a woman from County Cork, Ireland, befriended Elinor, sharing childcare and recipes. Another neighbor refused to acknowledge the couple, turning away when they passed in hallways. The couple faced practical obstacles beyond housing. Banks were reluctant to extend credit. Insurance companies charged higher premiums. Some stores refused service. These discriminations were rarely explicit. More often, they took the form of unavailability, delays, bureaucratic complications that made normal transactions difficult. Documentation of these experiences survives in letters Elinor wrote to her sister in New York. One letter, dated November 1947, describes an encounter at a furniture store. The salesman told us they had no payment plans available, even though the advertisement clearly stated terms. When I pressed him, he said the terms were for qualified buyers. We left and found another store that was willing to work with us. Yet the couple persisted. They established routines, built connections, created a life despite obstacles. Friedrich enrolled in evening English classes at a local high school. Elinor joined a veterans organization for former military nurses. They attended a Baptist church in Roxbury, where the congregation welcomed them without reservation. By December 1947, they had saved enough to purchase furniture, including a crib for their son. They opened a joint savings account at a local credit union. They applied for life insurance through a veterans organization that could not legally discriminate. They began the slow process of building stability in a society that had not fully decided whether to accept them. The Boston period lasted 18 months. In March 1949, Friedrich received an opportunity that would take them back to Germany, but this time as a family with legal status and American backing. Stuttgart, Germany, April 1949. The United States Army established a hospital in the American occupation zone. The facility required medical personnel who spoke both English and German, who understood both American and German medical practices. Friedrich Albert's unique background, Luftwaffe medical training, U.S. hospital experience, Bilingual fluency, American permanent residency made him an ideal candidate. The position offered $90 per week, housing on the military installation, and access to post-exchange facilities. For Elinor, the opportunity meant continuing her nursing career in a military hospital setting. The couple accepted and moved to Stuttgart in April 1949. The return to Germany placed Friedrich in a complex position. He had left as a defeated POW in 1946. He returned as an American resident employed by U.S. occupation forces. The transformation reflected broader changes in Germany's status. By 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was forming in the Western zones. The currency reform of June 1948 had stabilized the economy. The Marshall Plan was channeling millions of dollars into reconstruction. Stuttgart had suffered severe damage during Allied bombing. The city center was rubble, but rebuilding progressed rapidly under American administration. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, new housing blocks rose in cleared areas, the population was returning from 700,000 in 1939, the population had dropped to 400,000 by 1945, but recovered to 550,000 by 1949. Elinor and Friedrich lived in officers' housing at Robinson Barracks, a U.S. Army installation on Stuttgart's outskirts. The housing was Quonset huts, semicircular corrugated steel structures originally designed as temporary military shelters. Each unit contained 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom. Compared to their Boston apartment, the accommodations were spacious and modern, with central heating, hot water, and indoor plumbing. Their son attended kindergarten on the base. He was now 3 years old, speaking both English and German, navigating 2 cultures with the ease of early childhood. For him, the military base was normal, a place where Americans and Germans worked together, where his mother's race and his father's nationality were unremarkable facts rather than sources of conflict. The occupation environment created a controlled space where social experiments could proceed without civilian resistance. Military installations operated under federal law, bypassing state-level anti-miscegenation statutes. Base housing assignments followed military regulations rather than local customs. Schools on base were integrated before public schools in much of the United States. Yet tensions existed. Some American soldiers resented Germans, holding grudges from the war. Some German civilians viewed occupation personnel with suspicion or hostility. Friedrich occasionally faced antagonism from both sides, from Germans who saw him as a collaborator, from Americans who saw him as a former enemy. Elinor faced different but parallel challenges. The army had desegregated in 1948, but implementation proceeded slowly. Some officers resisted integration, some enlisted personnel refused to serve under black officers. Social segregation persisted in many military communities despite official policy changes. The couple's strategy was to focus on work, to maintain professionalism, to build relationships cautiously. Friedrich became known for his skill in trauma care. Elinor earned a reputation for excellence in surgical nursing. Their competence created respect that overcame some, though not all, prejudice. Statistics from 1949 show that approximately 15,000 war brides were living in Germany with their American military spouses. Most were German women married to American men. Powell and Albert represented a rare inversion, an American woman with a German husband, both working for U.S. occupation forces. The couple remained in Stuttgart until December 1951. During that time, Friedrich's English improved to near-native fluency. Elinor learned German to conversational proficiency. Their son grew up bicultural and bilingual. They saved money for an eventual return to the United States, where Friedrich planned to pursue American citizenship and medical recertification. The Cold War intensified during their time in Stuttgart. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 demonstrated Soviet willingness to challenge Western access to the divided city. The formation of NATO in April 1949 formalized the Western alliance. Germany's importance as a buffer against Soviet expansion grew daily. In this context, the success of war bride marriages took on strategic significance. These unions bound Germans to Americans through family ties, creating networks of connection that reinforced political alliances. Powell and Albert's marriage, once forbidden, now served American foreign policy objectives. New Haven, Connecticut, January 1952. Friedrich Albert sat for the United States medical licensing examination. He had spent the previous year completing prerequisite coursework at Yale University, using GI Bill benefits that extended to war bride spouses under a 1950 amendment. The examination would determine whether his German medical training could be recognized in the United States. The path to medical licensing in America was arduous for foreign-trained physicians. State medical boards required completion of medical education at accredited institutions. most of which were in the United States or Britain. Applicants had to demonstrate English proficiency, pass written and practical examinations, and complete internship requirements under American supervision. Friedrich's Luftwaffe training was extensive but not equivalent to American medical education. He had completed a 3-year military medical program focused on trauma care, field surgery, and emergency medicine. American medical schools required 4 years of undergraduate pre-medical education followed by 4 years of medical school. The gap was significant. Yale offered a pathway. The university had established a program for foreign-trained physicians in 1948, recognizing that European medical education, while different in structure, often equaled or exceeded American standards in rigor. The program evaluated foreign credentials, identified gaps, and provided coursework to address deficiencies. Friedrich enrolled in September 1951, taking courses in pharmacology, anatomy, pathology, and clinical practice. Elinor worked at Yale New Haven Hospital to support the family during Friedrich's studies. Her nursing salary was $110 per week, enough to cover rent, food, childcare, and tuition. They lived in married student housing, a 2-bedroom apartment in a converted military barracks that Yale had purchased as surplus after the war. The examination took place over 3 days. Written sections covered anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, pathology, and clinical medicine. Practical sections required diagnosis of patients, interpretation of X-rays, demonstration of surgical techniques. Of the 42 foreign-trained physicians who took the Connecticut examination in January 1952, 17 passed. Friedrich was among them. Licensing opened new possibilities. Friedrich secured a residency at Yale New Haven Hospital in internal medicine, beginning July 1952. The residency paid $2,000 annually, modest by physician standards, but combined with Elinor's income, sufficient for financial stability. More importantly, it placed Friedrich on a path to full medical practice. The couple's economic trajectory showed the possibility of integration, from poverty-level conditions in post-war Germany through working-class employment in Boston to middle-class professional status in Connecticut. The progression took 6 years and required extraordinary effort, but it was achievable within the systems that post-war America had established. Statistics from the Immigration and Naturalization Service show that German war brides and their spouses had higher than